A big thanks to Raycon for sponsoring this video. Before we start, I should probably admit that I'm a huge fan of the Assassin's Creed series. Assassin's Creed 2 was the first game I bought for my shiny new PS3. I've played every single mainline entry since the 2007 original and 100%ed around half of them. I briefly held a world record for Assassin's Creed 3. I loved the multiplayer component of earlier Assassin's Creed games and would absolutely be making guides on them if they were still being made, and I even went to watch the admittedly terrible Assassin's Creed movie in cinemas in 2016. I loved the combat, the stories, the Assassin's Brotherhood, the free running, and all the fun gadgets that came with being a master assassin. I'm still convinced that the older Assassin's Creed trailers are still some of the best that the games industry have made to date. By the time Syndicate came out in 2015, its poor sales indicated that the series needed some time off to reinvent itself, and after a 2-year break, Assassin's Creed Origins had completely transformed the series, and I really didn't like it. Origins had moved away from nearly everything I loved about the series to begin with. The free running had been stripped bare, the assassin aesthetic had been toned down, the combat was completely reworked, and the game had seemingly become an RPG disguised as an Assassin's Creed game. Look how they massacred Bye Boy, I said to myself. By Assassin's Creed Odyssey in 2018, the RPG formula had been solidified by some of the highest sales in the history of the series, and even though I liked the game a lot more, it still wasn't the series that I had once given so much admiration. Not my Assassin's Creed. When Valhalla was announced, it piqued my interest for a setting that looked really fucking cool, and when Ubisoft offered me an early access review key, I couldn't help but feel like myself from 2009 would be losing their absolute shit if they knew. I can confidently say that this is by far the best entry into the series since the great reinvention of 2017, but the real question is whether it can win back the people who had fallen in love at the very inception of the franchise. Let's see if we can't answer that question. The story sees the Viking Eivor, who can be swapped between the male and female version at any time, compelled to leave the overcrowded Norway and make a new home in Anglo-Saxon England. This isn't a story about making first contact by any means, as the first raids conducted on the island took place around 80 years prior, and by the time you arrive, the Sons of Ragnar have already been operating for nearly a decade. The story is about making alliances with the clans that already occupy the land, and to forge your own path within your own community. I've talked about this before, but in terms of writing, I think Ubisoft works best when they are making use of defined and charismatic characters, and when comparing this to the recently released Watch Dogs Legion that had very few concrete characters at all, I don't have a hard time defending my statement. The cutscenes especially really allow Ubisoft to flex their muscles in the storytelling department, and early in the game, there's a single take cutscene fight that goes for around 3.5 minutes and really shows how good the developers can be at this kind of storytelling. The one weak point I could find story-wise was the protagonist Eivor, as I just didn't think he could stand up to the heavyweights like Ezio, Edward Kenway, or Cassandra. In fact, he was often outshined by many of the characters around him, but when you're trying to make a more neutral character that is a more clean slate for the player, it's probably unsurprising when the clearly defined strangers in a world of Vikings end up being more interesting.
Excuse me, I have a slight pain. Do you notice anything on my head?
With this being said, I'd wager that most players will be much more interested in the combat, and Valhalla gives you ample reason to start cracking skulls. Murdering people can once again be split into 3 separate categories: traditional fighting, archery, and assassination skills. The hand-to-hand combat returns from the previous 2 games, which is a very dodge-heavy system that sees you essentially wear down an opponent's stamina with parries and damage until you can eventually execute them in one shot. These executions may well be the best the series has to offer, as each and every one of them are absolutely fucking brutal. Just fucking look at this guy getting his bell rung. Enemy types are also a huge step up in Valhalla, with 22 different archetypes being present throughout the world, and they genuinely make you play much differently, depending on their threat level and movesets. These range from super defensive shield bearers to chunky boys that will just peg motherfuckers across the battlefield. Weapon variety is also quite good, and everything you start swinging at an enemy feels different enough to justify its place in your big wide arsenal. Eivor can wield 2 weapons at a time, and depending on which hand you equip them, will determine your overall fighting style. This does indeed mean that there's absolutely nothing stopping you from dual wielding 2 shields and still making enemies more useless than the quality control department at Bethesda. The second school of fighting is archery, which I was personally reluctant to use. If there's an option to use a bow in a close quarters game, you can bet that I'm usually going to be maining that shit almost all of the time, but in the interest of actually making use of the rare opportunity to review a game with even a slight hint of credibility, I opted against doing so. The good news for people who like this playstyle is that it's really fucking strong. With a few upgrades and perks, I was able to absolutely fucking melt people exponentially faster than with my hand-to-hand weapons. This kind of build is really only limited by your number of arrows, but assuming you can keep a steady stock and afford to keep upgrading your quiver, I could absolutely see players rolling credits without a single close quarter kill. The third school of death is assassination, which is just comfort food when living in a post-RPG Assassin's Creed universe. The hidden blade returns, thank fuck, but Eivor, being a chap Viking, refuses to hide it on the underside of his arm. Assuming enemies aren't particularly powerful, players are still able to one-shot unsuspecting enemies, and if they allocate perk points in the right area, can even fully take down the toughest of enemies with a successful quick time event. I do miss the days when getting the drop on someone meant a guaranteed kill, but this is a really good compromise that I was more than happy to accept. Progression as a whole comes in many different forms in Valhalla, but in terms of combat, there are 2 main ways to get stronger. The first is the skill tree, which is by far the biggest the series has produced. Most of the nodes are simple stat boosts, but each cluster offers a significant perk, like auto looting on a kill, or double assassinations. The good news is that you can respec any and all skill points at no cost, meaning if you feel compelled to completely change your build, you're free to explore another playstyle without jumping through any unnecessary hoops. In one example, I bought a skill that allowed me to trap enemy bodies, but in the 3 times I used it, I only managed to slightly hurt a high level enemy, blow up a monk trying to pay his respects, and hurt an ally who seemed to have no sense of self-preservation. After this string of failures, I decided it would be best to focus on other areas of the skill tree.
Nothing bad ever happens to the Kennedys!
Ubisoft stated that around power level 150 is when builds start really coming into their own, but because I was only able to get my hands on Valhalla around 6 days before its release date, I didn't even get halfway to this threshold before I needed to frantically get started on this video. It's too early to say whether the skill tree will be seen as better or worse by long-time players, but viewers who like the RPG side of the Assassin's Creed combat will absolutely not be disappointed. What I will say is that the longer I was exposed to the combat of Valhalla, and the less I compared it to previous entries, the more it surprisingly started to win me over. This is the most refined the combat has been in a very long time, and I suspect may even be completely reworked in the next entry, following the huge amount of attention Ghost of Tsushima received for its extremely well polished swordplay. The other form of combat progression comes from books of knowledge, which unlock abilities like remembering you have a stockpile of axes in your pocket, or being able to blot out the sun with arrows. The RPG nature of Valhalla, like the last 2 entries, does however mean that you'll be soft-locked until you can become powerful enough to safely explore different areas. Staying along the story path never seemed to be an issue, but trying to complete a raid that out-leveled me was really fucking challenging. My first attempt saw an angry man with a pike delete my health out of nowhere after 5 minutes of conservative combat. My second attempt was upended after another motherfucker with a pike blindsided me on the way out of the building, and my third attempt ended with being impaled while I was locked into a loot animation. After around my 6th attempt and my 20th use of the run like a bitch move, I breached into that final room like a fucking Navy SEAL and finally got that well earned loot. Raids that you're properly leveled to complete are nowhere near this hard, as after all, stupid monks don't know how to fight nearly as well as mighty Vikings, and gathering supplies from these raids are essential for upgrading your settlement. In terms of the on and off base building of the franchise, Valhalla serves to provide the most fleshed out system to date, and presumably tries to fix a few of the regrets that kept the creative director of Assassin's Creed 3 up at night. Players can prioritize what kind of buildings are constructed first, with each one offering services or stat boosts depending on your choice. For example, I wanted to customize Eivor's appearance, so I decided to build a space for the barber to do his work. I then immediately discovered that without bringing him other designs, the only fucking haircuts he knows how to do are to leave the hair exactly as it is, or cut everything off. The settlement also has a regular range of side activities, like a surprisingly fun dice game, drinking competitions, rap battles that can increase your charisma, and the standard Ubisoft activity of taking hallucinogenic herbs. Let's talk about graphics, and by extension, the world itself. When I started the first few missions in Norway, I was absolutely not impressed with what I saw. There was nearly no variety in the landscape. I was getting some pretty inconsistent frame rates, and the entire country seemed frankly pretty devoid of anything to find. Then, like mirroring the characters themselves, moving to greener pastures, my arrival in England coincided with a performance patch, and by Odin's mighty beard, this shit looks good. I've become convinced that Ubisoft's obsession with happy herbs may have finally paid off, as every 20 minutes, you find yourself in a break between the looting, selling, and skull crushing, and you slow down to realize that you're standing in the middle of a painting. This is especially helped by the decision to cut down on the user interface, and I was spending much less time looking at map markers and more on the physical world. It's probably not a fair comparison, but I had some serious Red Dead Redemption vibes while traveling through the English countryside. It's a hard task to follow the vibrant grandeur of ancient Greece, but what's on display is truly an impressive leap forward. People often forget that the progress of civilization has traditionally been less of an upward trending line and more of a series of peaks and troughs, and when exploring the humble settlements that have sprung up around the inconceivable ancient architecture of the Roman Empire, I could not have been more sold on the setting of 9th century England. Assassin's Creed Valhalla doesn't have the ray tracing secret weapon of Watch Dogs, but when considering its artistic direction, I'm going to make the bold statement that it still wins in the visual department and claims the title as the best looking Ubisoft game to date.
That's a good idea. We'll do that in the morning. First light.
This is particularly important because players are heavily incentivized to explore. Exploration will help you gather resources for your settlement, new books of knowledge for powerful abilities, and new weapons and armor, which unlike Odyssey, are much rarer and more valuable. It seems as if the developers wanted players to become more attached to their equipment and further incentivize them to spend resources into upgrading them over time. I'm the type of player who cringes whenever a game lists exploration as a selling point, because pretty much any open world game could feature exploration, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything interesting to find. In this case, however, Valhalla has been the exception in a long list of games that I really haven't cared to more deeply discover. In terms of more traditional Assassin's Creed gameplay, there is an entire storyline that caters to this aspect of Eivor. However, it very much takes a backseat to his main occupation of being a merry Viking. Eivor can climb without much trouble, but doesn't do so with as much style or resolve when compared to other members of the Brotherhood. Free running doesn't show quite as much value among the mostly flat English countryside, and players won't be seeing any flashy shit that French assassins would be pulling off nearly 1,000 years later. Eivor isn't primarily an assassin and has not been trained in the assassin doctrine, meaning that even staple abilities like the leap of faith need to be learned before they can be used. Much like every other Assassin's Creed title, there's an in-game store that offers a bunch of cosmetic options that are probably best to ignore, as well as shit like map hacks to know where all the valuable items are located and to put hardworking, salt of the earth guide YouTubers out of business. Like everyone else watching, I also find this quite off-putting in an already full-priced game. It's an addition that's difficult to defend at the best of times, so the best advice I can really give is to vote with your wallets and ignore the whole shop entirely. What I will say, however, is that for the money-conscious gamer, Ubisoft actually has a pretty good deal going. The Ubisoft store on PC has a subscription service for $15 a month, which allows you to play every single Ubisoft title day one, including all season pass and deluxe edition content. For those doing the calculations in their head, this does indeed mean that a person can start and finish both Assassin's Creed Valhalla and Watch Dogs Legion and cancel the subscription just in time for Cyberpunk to finally release. All things considered, there are far worse ways you could be passing the time, and far fewer for such a small amount of money. Assassin's Creed Valhalla continues its commitment to the RPG genre and will no doubt retain the many new players it gained from the huge success of Odyssey in 2018. With this being said, as a grizzled Assassin's Creed veteran, I was satisfied with the compromises made to better cater to my demographic. Since the series turned itself into an RPG, I've been desperately trying to love it as much as the people who were able to unshackle themselves from their love of a simple time. But as soon as I stopped seeing this for what it could be and appreciating the refinement of this new direction, for the first time in 5 years, I'm finally ready to give the Assassin's Creed franchise their well-earned time in the sun. If you're having a hard time finding a holiday gift, or just want to get yourself something nice, then Raycon wireless earbuds might be what your life is missing. As someone who's been using a pair of Raycons nearly every day for the past 7 months, I absolutely haven't been disappointed, as the case is small enough to fit in my right side dominant phone pocket. The 6-hour battery life has not once caught me off guard, and once you make the switch to wireless, it'll change your fucking life. Raycon earbuds also sound great, and whether I'm listening to bass heavy music to rattle my tiny lizard brain, or the 5th podcast of the week, spending time outdoors has never been more bearable. Raycon is so easy to recommend, because not only are they half the price of other premium earbuds, but if you're even 1% unsatisfied, they'll even let you return them for a full refund. On top of this, going to buyraycon.com/surswag will get you another 20% discount for a limited time. Raycon, adapting to the extinction of the headphone jack.
I see a red door and would see it painted black. No colors, no